Hello everyone, we are Team Resilient Metropoles from Studio Bhooshan. I am Nishtha with my teammates Sidharth and Ashwin. And we are proposing a new Amsterdam, a template for new coastal cities. Currently, 8 out of 10 megacities are on the coast, and around 40% of the world population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. Because of the trade, which is the major factor of development for cities on the coast, and resources like oil rigs, and for some cities, tourism is generating their major economy. As per World Bank Urban Development Report, 1.2 million square meter of new urban area is expected by 2050, and we believe that it will be on the coast because of all the advantages it has to offer for a city growth, but the location of coast also comes with an issue of flooding, where already 1/4 of the world population is exposed to flood, and it will increase every decade. Currently, cities are using barriers to protect, but they cost a lot and only a temporary solution to this inevitable issue. But cities like Amsterdam are flood resilient by design, built with the network of canals, being the center of attraction for the whole city. Used in the beginning for trade and now for the tourism, where everyone has paid for their share of canal frontage, reflecting the city which followed water and economy over time. With Amsterdam, our research is centered towards the growth of Amsterdam over the last 800 years, where all the canals and infrastructure were communally funded. Zooming into the current land use of the city, most of the regions are mixed use. Even 400-year-old canal houses are also mixed use, consisting retail, storage, residential, and workshop in same narrow building, which was rarely more than 9 meters because of the land value of the canal frontage. With the case study, we are taking forward the major water management elements of the canals and the urban squares and the land use which will grow over time to form the city following economy and water. But we do not have another 800 years to wait for another city, and we cannot keep building 3-story narrow canal houses.
We played city skylines and found out that it has an event of disasters which simulates the damage and the resilience of the city, and also the player can specify the epicenter of the disaster for the city. We also replace some buildings with our massings to simulate its interaction with human agents in the game. And you can also see the disaster reports it generates. So City Skyline has this intuitive UI within it, and the rule sets inherently developed. And yeah, moving forward, we are combining the studies. Our research framework is centered towards the urban fabric, 4D land use, and the building tiles.
We are proposing our prototypical coastal city at the Thames estuary, which is the entrance to the trade route from Europe and estimated to develop at least 1.3 million new jobs in next 25 years. Under urban study, we studied canals and street networks. First, we started with analyzing different grids under flooding conditions, like rectangular from New York and radial from Amsterdam. We found the curvature of the grids helping in reducing the velocity of the water. To study the urban curvatures, we studied Amsterdam and Venice, which are canal-centric historic cities. The curvature in both the cities varies. In Amsterdam, it is eccentric radial canals, whereas in Venice, it is made up of several separate islands, hence has organic canals. We found that due to uniform curvature in Venice, during low water levels, the water is stagnant in the city in some cases, in some areas, which is causing issues for the residents. Whereas in Amsterdam, canals allow flooding in and out. Canals allows water in and out the city smoothly. Urban studies led us to the study of different canal nodes. We found out with variation, wide mouths and reducing the width, allowing stretches allows reducing speed gradually, and too tight curvature led to overtopping. Under branching study, we found 60-degree branching allows energy dissipation as well as avoids overtopping in junctions, and 30 degrees relative angles can be used to accommodate extra water from main canals. And gradually increasing the degree of branching allows uniform energy dissipation, and branching mouths also helps in reducing the inundation at riverfront. For canal design, first step was to test different angles with respect to the coastline for each stretch of the canal. We found the range of 60 to 90 can be used, but less than that leads to the overtopping. And for the second stretch, we studied different angles with respect to the first stretch. We found that if first stretch is 90 degrees, second cannot be less than 75 and neither can be 90 in order to achieve the curvature. Whereas the 60 degree, it can all be in the range of 75 to 90 and depending upon the stretch along the canals. To design on site, we found low points on the terrain with the surface runoff and iterated on site with existing canals and added iterations on extensions which can allow extra water to flow through and further iterated by bifurcation, width variation and avoiding sharp angles and curvatures.
Under physical prototype, we made a flood tank to test our canal iterations in which we noticed water showing inundation at the nodes behind due to low points. And as a result, we could map to create the urban sinks that we can use in the fabric to deal with this issue. And also the inundation zones which made to be improved with different canal making strategies. And we also tested it in case of heavy rainfall where we studied the surface runoff and its effective distribution of placement of the canal, how it tackles the load of surface runoff water. Yeah. And also water was accumulating in almost the same regions in the tests. And this was a previous test in which in this scenario we didn't include the node and angle iterations. And it was created with that. And we could map more inundation areas and concentrated sinks which were better designed in the other iterations.
The next step was a street study, seeing cities like Manhattan and their urban fabric. Where more than 70% of the city is impervious, it becomes important to research about how streets needs to be designed with respect to the terrain to minimize the water accumulation in the city. We studied a research around about water-based street networks, where street grows from one end to the other, considering the angle of iterations, angle of freedom. For example, in this case, if the angle of freedom is 1 degree, street will grow by finding the lowest point in that 1 degree of freedom. And if the degree of freedom is 30, it will assess the next lowest point in that range of vision. And streets grow like this with like 1 and 10 degree of freedom, considering the terrain as the map. We did some iterations with 0, 5, 10, 20, 30, and 40 degrees of freedom. We chose 0, 10, and 40 to analyze more. On the rules of direction with respect to the terrain, streets parallel to the slope allows least accumulation and perpendicular to it has most accumulation. And we analyze the iterations. 0 degree of freedom has no relation to the terrain, and 40 degree creates negative junctions, has more accumulation. Whereas we found 10 degree freedom is best of all, we can see least red zone. So there is an average range of growth which can satisfy both water and terrain based growth. Further, we converted this study into an analog model where we made a frame of grid of 50 by 50 meters. We take the terrain data and map it to the gradient, and we fix it to the frame. We start by mapping the canals first and then the major streets to give the global orientation and the parcels after that. The steel core wires and the grid allows us the same degree of freedom range that we studied in the research, and also controls the curvature of the streets. These were some of the iterations we did where we are trying to fuse different grids as well, radial to, for example, radial to rectangular, or diagonal to rectangular. Moving from urban fabric, we are proposing a 4D land use simulation prototype with multiple players. We also looked into the ghost towns in China, which has left the country in losses and debts. There are 65 million vacant houses in them, whereas Amsterdam's growth along with infrastructure was over time and communally funded. has survived 800 years. Our land use system is a proposal for resilience against these ghost cities. The first prototype of the game is a block game. It is a two-player game which we played ourselves. One had the role of developer and other was the government. And the site was a grid of land parcels with descending land value as per the proximity from the sea. Players has blocks of different land uses to buy and different strategies they can invest in to make their buildings in city area resilient. And they can also buy parcels to dig canals. This was the first simulation that we did. After every turns, there are events like floods and storm. So we can analyze how many buildings survive after every event by how much players has invested in the strategies when they were playing. These are the rules for the second prototype. It is a multiplayer game. Out of them, one of is the communal player who unlocks the parcels to be occupied by other players, who pays the communal player for the land and also borrow a loan. They can choose to play or to pass. The land value is mapped on the unlocked parcels in the beginning of the map. It is mapped according to the natural context. With each move, land value of each parcel changes, which can increase or decrease considering the occupied parcels in the context later on. Under land use, we have residential, industrial, commercial, and offices. Majorly known as the RECO programs, and other are the recreational and green spaces, where each land use is given a factor and a construction cost with which is multiplied with the area. And for revenue, players collect rent from the building, from their buildings, and pay taxes to the communal player, which uses the money to buy infrastructure like canals and roads for the city. And if player invests in the strategies like these, they get a reduction in the tax, like a subsidy, and which gives resilience and character to the city in return. So that's a win-win situation. In this first iteration, where there are multiple players and stakeholders who can buy land and build the Kuro city, one of the players goes bankrupt in the end, and games end as the goal of it is to build a city which is economically progressing and stable together, not for one of them to win. In the third prototype, where we have assigned stakeholders the role of investors of residential, industrial, commercial, and offices, so that the needs of all the users can be catered. And we have a new rule that the players investing in higher land value will receive higher revenue. The play allowed players to invest according to their preferences. Like office players might not need to invest in the higher value riverfront views, whereas industrial can build not more floors and invest in the land area. In the fourth prototype, we use the rules incorporated before with the modular alphabets to define the form of the city throughout. In the next prototype, we have defined the blocks in the range which unlocks with the population growth, so that which it can give the whole city global orientation and 3D parametric view.
Moving forward in the building scale, not only the growth of the city limits the building, also the distance from the water, it affects the buildings, which is based on different tire zones, which are called subtidal and intertidal zones. And moving forward, the design strategy for the building scale, we are approaching it in two levels. One is in the tower level, where the tower deals with the wind, high-speed winds, and there is another level which is at the bottom, which is a shell structure, which deals with the water and the flood-related resilience. So we tested different primitive geometry against wind, in which the geometry with least cross-section at the behind proved to be more streamlined. And further iterations, we found oval as more resilient and feasible shape to be like against water and wind. Yeah, and to take this study even more forward into the 3D, three-dimensional space, we did porosity study, where we studied different floor plate arrangements, where you can see the straight floor plates, and there are some staggered floor plates, and there are porosities created on different edge conditions, from which we found out the staggered floor plates seems to have created more low velocity zone at the behind, which mitigates the wind very well. And the building scale, in which the geometry follows the land use, and the programmatic massings that come from the game are converted into architectural spaces, which influences the architectural spaces. And these massings are developed based on the studies that we did earlier, the wind studies and the water studies. They will be pre-configured, and the player can play the programmatic masses. And these are the tower typologies which we developed for based on different floor heights, as we have tier-based gradation and also the city growth-based gradation over the city. So these are different floor heights for the tower, and these are the menu of replacement of those voxels into an architectural geometry, and this can happen in many combinatorial ways, since these facades are made out of unique instances that can be combined to form different iterations to make the whole city, which will help us build the whole city faster.
In order to achieve resilience, we created different building massing in response to various terrain conditions. Similarly, for shell structure, we explored form finding method to design geometries that correspond to various outcomes from the Just a second. Similarly, for the shell structure, we explored form-finding methods to design geometries that correspond to various outcomes from the land use simulation. Here are some studies of single-layer shell, and here are some studies on how multi-layer massing outcomes are translated into multi-layer shell, where void space can result in open spaces. Further, where layer of shells was divided according to level, provided open cutouts for open. Further, spatial layouts were explored according to explored form, where layouts divided into parcels to provide better view frontage. The unique residential modules were created to provide various combinatoric, such as vertical, horizontally combined, recessed, and overhang tile, which combine to form the residential spaces. These are the tiles for the commercial and the office spaces, created to adapt different spatial condition and people capacity. Tower geometry is further comprises of facades and structural system. We develop a modular facade system that correspond to the assigned program and podium. These are the facades varies and differentiated according to the uses, like residential units, commercial units staggered, and double height office plus commercial, and double height offices plus open void. These facade components are designed to be compatible with robotic hot wire cutting as a fabrication technique. Next, it is one of the building tiles conversion from the game, the cruise terminal, which is unique to the building. These are some renders of it.
Amsterdam has been a proposal before for New York, and we believe our proposal can be the new template for the upcoming coastal cities as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Video है यार ये तो video है.
Keep it in that render, final render.
I created a video for that.
One of the instances.
It's fine. Don't
A
panic.
growing city, so we have the canals and the roads which are still growing, and these are the street network mapping studies that we do, and it can be explored more than the terrain. We can map like different population densities or different land uses to into a gradient and map the streets accordingly. For example, this one was different than the terrain, where we decided to have like different population densities on the rear ends and plan the canals accordingly. And these were the models from our geometry, and those are the models of the fabric that we tested in the flood tank.
So can you explain again the analysis of it's a very hot topic that cities getting flooded. And just wondering from the analysis when you decided the new master plan, what is actually so different? What does your master plan so different than Amsterdam and Venice? Because I'm just wondering from your analysis that you look at the topic of water, cities get flooded, which is an important topic for the future. I just wonder if this is your driving factor for generating the new city. What changes the way you design the buildings? If this is your driving factor to creating this new city, can you explain a bit more the relationship between your main topic and the layout and the design of each building?
Yeah. So, considering Amsterdam and Venice, like they are canal-centric cities, but the density there and the building typology there is very we believe we cannot keep on building 3-story high canal houses anymore. We need to accommodate like 25 million people in next like 25 years. So we need to build higher. So we are proposing like a template of buildings which you can choose, like in the form of a game where player can choose from a set of buildings which are not just designed abruptly. They'll unlock themselves like when the player starts growing the city. As the population grows, the bigger buildings will unlock. So that will be the building unlocks itself according to the growth of the city and the economy in the city around. So we are proposing the template because we need to accommodate more. We need to accommodate more density, more people into the same area. So that is different from the historic cities.
And also we try to create mixed use development so that we could decrease the amount spent to create amenities and infrastructures, so which will obviously decrease the tax collected by the people. So we went with building of mixed use for that.
When I look at the test you did, how the water hits the waterfront and then the water goes into the canals, I just would think that you would design the buildings on the waterfront different. Maybe they're elevated because they will be flooded, and then the water is going into the canals, and then you have maybe more low-rise buildings which are connected to the waterfront. But when I look at the overall image, it seems quite homogeneous. I would imagine that the buildings on the waterfront are significantly different to the ones in the back. When I look at your analysis of these blue diagrams and how they float into the canal and or also even water comes out. Or even like on the waterfront, they're upside down, and the building volume is actually elevated, and there's a lot of free space underneath, and gives shading, and the land use is very different than when the building's in the back. You have terracing for sunlight, for wind. You also mentioned wind. So that's what I'm a bit surprised that there is not. So what is the water to do with the building typology you designed? That's a bit my question.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question, and also kind of like gets to the heart of what I think is actually fascinating about the project, which is the sort of like rigor and, you know, to some extent precision with which you've conducted these sort of empirical and simulational tests, right? What you're doing is you're designing a sponge, right? You're making the city that's a sponge, and there are a couple of things around sponges that I think are relevant to this project. I mean, first of all, especially when you're dealing with sort of like surge water kind of mitigation, section is essential, right? And if you consider any sort of like if you consider any developed city, a city like London is built on rivers. There are all sorts of buried rivers which became the sort of basis for sewage infrastructure. There's a way in which these kinds of channels don't necessarily have to be only the sort of large-scale channels, but they become the sort of like veins and arteries that penetrate into these islands and become something which is actually like volumetric. And if you extend that idea, if you extend this logic of sort of like, you know, this sort of plumbing that's intended to address storm surge as opposed to sort of like human, like, as opposed to accommodating sort of like human needs, the plumbing can actually sort of like filigree up into the buildings, right? You can imagine the buildings as an extension of that sponge idea. And then the whole project becomes a kind of integral thing. The land, the water, the buildings, they're of a piece. And that's one of the things that I think is, you know, so compelling about this idea is you have an analytic framework and a kind of like generative approach to the geometry that can allow you to think about the whole project holistically in that way, which I think is actually quite fascinating. I mean, yeah, you're like on the cusp of it. I just kind of would love to see that played through a little bit more completely. Like if you were to think about the buildings themselves as having reservoirs or channels or sort of things that mitigate some of those storm surge impacts, what would that look like? How would it integrate with the land itself? It becomes a really it has the potential to be really holistically conceived.
How did you do the water simulations?
We started with the digital simulations first, but after doing that for quite time, we wanted to test it physically also, because the water simulations are not quite accurate. So that's why we did the water tank test to test the accuracy of the simulations that we did.
Yeah, but how did you do the digital simulations?
Digital simulations.
Yeah. In Blender or
Blender.
Yeah. And I think so. I want to applaud you on the physical tests, because I think you know, it's time consuming, and I think it was very fascinating to look at, and very often the digital world and the simulations are different than the physical world. There are small details and differences between the two. The thing about water simulations is that it doesn't scale, you know, doing water tests in the physical world, it doesn't scale very well because of surface tension. And so you always have to be a little bit cautious with water tank tests. But I think, that being said, it was still beneficial, and it was very intuitive for me seeing the test that you did. I think the Blender simulations and particle simulations, the granularity is not, I think it's difficult to trust those simulations, although it's great for visual presentation. I think your method, you had a very methodological, I can't say that word, approach, right? I followed it throughout your presentation, which was very clear. That was very nice. when you show the different grid analysis of the different cities, I think it was very ordered and had a scientific approach to it, which I appreciate. I think the final results could be investigated further. There is definitely building, it's in the physical presentation here. The building topologies becomes almost a little bit as an afterthought. But I think you actually had a lot of thoughts as soon as you started diving into it, and I completely agree that you could have integrated the water a little bit more there, probably. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I mean, I agree with the points that there is a clarity on all the kind of the steps, etc. But sometimes the clarity means that the project becomes too simple. Like if you understand everything, then maybe there is a level of complexity that is being left out. So I would maybe just question, like where is actually the complexity? Because for me, like the density is not really density. I like many of the aspects. I like the observation that you did, the studies of the kind of the water flow, the opening that you did here. I like the facade treatment. There are many of these things that are quite nice, but I think what maybe is missing is this one is density. What actually means density for you? What is the density of transport, of kind of water movement? The integration with the building, the ground floor. I mean, even if you just look Venice, the typology of the building is that the ground floor is actually the parking pretty much of the boat. So I know there is all these things like, I think that can be challenged a little bit more. Like now is always kind of the infrastructure. I mean, even if I look at the boat, let's say, is outside, and then I need to kind of walk inside the building. So I think more integration could have been pushed much more. And also I wonder, like, why do you talk about density? Because I don't really see density. I mean, it's low dense in a way.
Just from my side, I mean, maybe it's hard to marry this kind of morphology which is driven strongly by, once you start it, the demand comes to make it strongly driven by these flooding issues. And so the way Hannes and Andrew were talking about it, I would also, everybody seems to be urging you on in this way. And then this, I think, becomes into kind of contradiction nearly with the idea of a game with modules. Although you try to integrate the making of the canal with the game, so that was good. It's not an afterthought. So but still, this paradigm of placing modules makes it. Plays against this idea of this hyper adaptation to the local, let's say, proximity and exposure to water, and so to make that 3D sponge, which is interesting. And by the way, it's a prominent concept, sponge city, precisely for this condition. So I think that's where probably the problem comes from. And so maybe there could have been, I don't know how you modularize it or parametrically modularize, a bit like you've done with these branching logics and curve logics that would have been, maybe you can create a kind of parametric modularized sponge condition where, but that's where I see what is the frustration is coming from.
Yeah, just to pick up on that particular topic, I think like the merits of the project, like for me, has always been that like you're trying to think about resilience and or aspects of environmental sustainability and so on, like in a kind of bottom-up way, like which I think like you try to do with the canals, that it's not like a top-down drawn plan. But like it incrementally grows with respect to what already exists, and which canal was made where, and the next one depends on the previous state. Like, so it's a kind of state machine, like, which I think is interesting, and through that local logic, just following the terrain, that like some kind of global order can emerge is an interesting approach, I think. Although it is not fully convincing yet, because I think, like, as Patrick correctly picked up on, like the morphological, like these last two panels, for example, it's not sufficiently rich and adaptive, like to, as Hannes also was pointing out, that if buildings are placed next to the water versus if they're placed on the side street, like how do they vary? So the kind of genotype, phenotype variation axis of the project is perhaps the weaker part of it, which is why we're not perceiving a complexity that we expect from cities like Amsterdam and Venice and so on. And the other merit I found interesting in throughout the year in the way you approached the project was to consider how resilience is funded, right? Which is if you now think about Manhattan, like, you know, there's a massive project to build a seawall, whereas with Amsterdam, like, you try to also study the history of, like, how the funding aspect actually affects the frontage, right? Like, because everybody paid for it, there is a very narrow front, and so I believe, like, that is a glimpse of what could have been further studied, like, you know, the effect of you know, how things are funded on the urban morphology and how cities grow. For example, you missed the point of, like, in your original study, like, canals were only occupied on one side, like, which would be a wasteful way to, if you build a canal and then don't occupy it on either side, like, so, and which you corrected, or which you modified in the subsequent simulation. So these things, like, I think, like, are some of your merits, but as Patrick was pointing out and many others have picked up on, like, the idea of resilience or flooding doesn't penetrate all the way to the lower scales at the building level design, which perhaps it should, or which definitely it should. And not only that, like, that should kind of tie it back into the game, right? Like, so in terms of the benefits and costs to build certain things, like, so I think as a methodology and as a framework, it has been successful. And considering where you were in the summer to where you are now, I think, you know, you made quite some improvements, but still there is some many things left wanting. But, like, nonetheless, I commend you for making the effort and trying to cohere things into a bottom-up, or at least into a search for a bottom-up system for you know, resilient cities along the coast. Yeah.
One comment, I'm just wondering, just throw it out. Could it be like a city which works with water, which is almost like energy generating, you know, and then you can the software link to when you're on the waterfront on the front, you generate more energy and more for this plot, so it's more value. Yeah, so I'm trying to think of a way to connect the software with the tool of the tides, and you know, like, I do think it could be an interesting topic.
Actually,
how do you create these cities which are self-sufficient and generate energy in a way, how you design the canals most efficient to get the water in to generate more power, then you can link it to what a plot is worth.
Exactly. So that's something that they did try to do in that square game, like, which is on the fourth panel, where design features relate to, you know, you pay less insurance if, you know, so that they try to integrate the design aspect into the game through that mechanism, like, where you either pay because the buildings are better designed, obviously your, you know, amount of insurance you do is less, which is also a feature in the game, like City Skyline, where when you subject a city to catastrophic events like storms and stuff, like, some buildings survive and others don't, based on, like, what features they have. But it's a very underexplored aspect for sure, like, and maybe as a kind of self-critical reflection, like I do think that has been something that has been discovered but not sufficiently articulated, like which, you know, for the subsequent years, that's maybe something that like we can pick up on. Yeah.
So I advised a thesis project last year that was dealing with this question of how the architect engages game engines. And in particular, if the architect is a player in a game, who is the enemy of architecture, or what is the enemy of architecture? It's actually kind of, I think, an interesting question from a disciplinary perspective, is like, who are our enemies? And in a way, I don't know if it's your enemy exactly, but the actors or the agents that are players of the game are all human institutions. But the water is an important actor here as well. Right now, it's understood from the simulational perspective, kind of in the context of the game, but there could be a way in which it becomes an actor in a certain sense, right? And I think it's a really interesting paradigm. I mean, there's a lot of work in co-design or collaborative design these days, which is thinking about how you bring non-human actors into those kinds of dynamics. And I think it's, you know, if you were to take this kind of project further, it's, I think, a legitimate question. How do you begin to think about non-human actors as active participants in this game on par with human actors?